In this video, we're going to show you how to set up a new XG firewall out of the box. There are 5 simple steps we'll cover in detail. First, creating a Sophos ID. Then, starting your firewall and registering it. 3. Completing the setup wizard. 4. Confirming your firewall is operational. And finally, verifying and synchronizing your license. The first thing you'll need to do, if you haven't done so already, is set up your Sophos ID account. If you already have a Sophos ID account, you can skip ahead to the next part of this video. To set up a Sophos ID, visit sophos.com and click the icon in the top right part of the screen and select Create Sophos ID. Enter your first and last name and your business email address in the fields provided. Confirm you're not a robot and click Register. You will then receive a verification email at the email address you provided. If you don't see it right away, give it some time and check your junk mail folder in case your email provider inadvertently flagged it as spam. Click the link in the email to activate your account. Create a strong password and then log in using your new Sophos ID. Fill out the backup contact info if you like, save them, and then proceed to My Applications and select My Sophos. In My Sophos, select your profile and be sure to fill in the contact information fields here, including your company, country, and address. And then save the changes to complete your Sophos ID and My Sophos account setup. Before you start setting up your firewall, please make sure you have the following prerequisites: your Sophos ID credentials, your ISP settings, including whether you obtain a public IP address via DHCP or it's manually assigned to you, along with a netmask, gateway IP address, and DNS servers. And before you get started, head over to sophos.com/getstartedxg and download the latest XG Firewall Getting Started guide. After you've reviewed the Getting Started guide, make sure your firewall is connected to an internet connection on port 2, the default Wide Area Network or WAN interface, and that you have a computer connected to port 1 either directly or through a switch. Port 1 is the default LAN interface. On the computer you intend to use to set up your firewall, enable DHCP to receive an IP address automatically from the firewall, or follow the instructions in Step 4 of the Getting Started guide for manual network settings if you prefer. In this case, I'm using DHCP. You can then power on the firewall and wait a few minutes for the system to start. You'll know it's almost ready when your IP address and network settings get permanently assigned. Wait an additional minute or so for the device to finish starting up and then access the admin console. The admin console is accessible by default via HTTPS at 172.16.16.16 on port 4444. And the default credentials are admin and admin for the password. The first time you log in, you will be presented with the Sophos End User License Agreement. Review the terms and click I accept to proceed to the next step. The first step in setting up your firewall is to register your firewall with your Sophos ID account. This requires an internet connection, so you'll want to start by clicking Basic Setup. And depending on how your ISP operates, either enter your internet network settings manually here or select DHCP. If your ISP requires you to set up your connection manually, they will have provided you with an IP address, netmask, their gateway IP address, and DNS server addresses. If you have an upstream proxy, you can also enter that here. If your ISP supports DHCP, as mine does, simply select DHCP and your firewall will obtain the necessary internet connection settings automatically from the ISP's DHCP server. Click to save changes and then wait for the firewall network configuration to properly update, which can take up to 30 seconds. You'll know it's ready to go when you see the green pop-up message appear indicating the settings have been successfully updated and the setup screen closes. Now you can register the appliance to your Sophos ID by clicking the Register button. If nothing appears in the pop-up window, it means the firewall is unable to connect to Sophos servers, which usually means your internet connection is not properly configured, so please go back to the main screen and double-check your basic network settings. If you see the Sophos ID login screen, you can maximize this window as we will finish the setup process on this screen. If you've recently been logged into Sophos.com with your Sophos ID, as I have, you will see the welcome message like you see here. Alternatively, you will be prompted for your Sophos ID login and password. Enter them and confirm you are not a robot to proceed with registering your firewall to your Sophos ID. After the registration step is complete, you can synchronize your license at which point you will see the option to continue with the initial setup wizard. While you can skip this step and proceed directly to the management console, I strongly recommend you follow the steps in this video to set up your firewall using the wizard for the first time, as it will enable you to get up and running quickly and verify your firewall is operational with a minimum number of steps. You can then modify the configuration to meet your specific needs later, either by running the wizard again or reconfiguring these components using the regular configuration screens. Let's use the wizard to set up the basics now. The first step is to choose the deployment mode for the firewall. The most common deployment method is gateway mode, but you can also select bridge mode here if the XG firewall is operating in line with another firewall device. The next step is to configure the various interfaces on the device. The default settings are for port 1 to be set up with a static IP as your LAN interface. You can change the IP address here to match the address scheme you intend to use for your internal network. In this case, I'm going to leave it at the default of 172.16.16.16. Port 2 defaults to be your primary WAN interface, obtaining settings from your ISP as we set up earlier. You can see and verify the settings here. The next step is the DNS configuration, and the default selection here will depend on what we selected in the last step. Given I selected DHCP for the WAN interface, DNS has also defaulted to DHCP, but we have the option to set static DNS server settings if we want. This next step enables us to set up a default firewall rule for LAN to WAN traffic, which is convenient and recommended even if you plan to change this later. You can define what kind of policy enforcement you want to apply to your default firewall rule, including web filtering, app control, and IPS policies. I recommend you follow my example here on the initial setup and select None for these policies, and then apply a more appropriate policy later using the full suite of tools available to you in the management interface. In this step, we'll define the email notification settings. Simply enter your email address and mail server information. As with any of these settings, you can edit this later if needed. The last step is to set the time zone, date, and time. First, select your time zone from the drop-down list, and then simply check the box to use NTP service and choose the default to use the predefined NTP server or enter your preferred NTP server here. You can now review your settings if you like, and even go back and change things before clicking Finish. Note that clicking Finish will flush a number of settings, But since this is our initial setup, that's perfectly okay. So we click OK and the device will restart with our new settings. Now after the firewall restarts, which can take a few minutes, you can access the admin console again via HTTPS at the port 1 LAN IP address that you set in the wizard. If you left it unchanged as I did, you will access the console via 172.16.16.16 on port 4444 and then log in using the default credentials of admin and admin. You're now up and running. The first thing you should do is verify that your firewall is operational and passing traffic. Start by clicking the Interface widget on the Control Center to check the status of your interfaces. If you followed the setup wizard earlier in this video, port 1 should be connected to your LAN switch or computer, and port 2 should be connected to your wide area network or internet connection and be operating as the gateway, with the public IP address assigned by your ISP or retrieved via DHCP. Then go to the Firewall section and verify that the default rule you set up as part of the setup wizard process is present, accepting traffic flowing from any host on the LAN to any host on the wide area network, and that there are no other conditions set or filtering turned on except for NAT masquerading. Then I suggest you open another tab in your browser and confirm you have access to the internet by visiting sophos.com. If you are unable to access sophos.com and have followed the steps in the setup wizard earlier in this video, the most likely cause is related to your internet connection, ISP provider, or DNS. Double check your internet connection interface on port 2 and then your DNS settings. Perhaps try temporarily changing them to another known good DNS server like Google's at 8.8.8.8 and test your internet access again. Next, we will check and synchronize the licensing. From the top right menu on the console, select About Product or use the left navigation to select Administration. Either way, you will end up on the Licensing tab, which provides details on your device registration and your protection module subscription licenses. While your firewall will synchronize licensing periodically on its own, you may need to click Synchronize to see any recent changes reflected here. If you purchased a Total Protect or Enterprise Protect bundle, as I have in this instance, the subscriptions should show here as subscribed with the correct expiry date after synchronizing the license. If you purchased any protection module or support subscriptions separately, you will have a license schedule that was either emailed to you or provided by your Sophos partner that is a PDF document that looks like this, with a section titled License Keys. The information in blue is the description of what you've purchased. The long string in gray text on white background is your license key. Copy the license key and then switch back to your firewall, and on the Licensing tab, click Activate Subscription and paste the licensing key into the field in this pop-up window and click Verify Key. After the key has been verified, click Confirm to activate the subscription and then click Synchronize to synchronize your firewall with the licensing system. You will then see the module subscription details have been updated to reflect your new activation. Your firewall is now operational and licensed and ready for you to apply some of the great protection and controls XG Firewall has to offer. I highly recommend you watch the rest of the videos in the Getting Started series and any other XG Firewall how-to videos that are appropriate for your environment. Thank you for watching and enjoy your new XG Firewall.